For years, the friendship between Burt Reynolds and Jerry Reed looked effortless, two giants moving in sync, one reshaping Hollywood with raw charisma, the other redefining American music with instinct, humor, and grit. On screen, their bond felt natural, almost carefree, built on laughter, shared Southern roots, and a chemistry audiences instantly trusted. But what the cameras captured was only the surface. Beneath the jokes and easy smiles was a complicated dynamic marked by unspoken tension, loyalty tested over time, and truths that were never meant to be said out loud. And when Burt Reynolds finally broke his silence about Jerry Reed, it wasn't nostalgia that surfaced. It was something far more uncomfortable, doored away from the spotlight. Their bond followed a far more complicated path. And before he passed, Burt Reynolds finally said what he had kept buried for years about Jerry Reed. When those words surfaced, they reframed a friendship audiences thought they understood. For decades, the duo felt inseparable on screen, two men trading humor and loyalty as if it required no effort at all. The chemistry felt real because it was, but behind the box office glow, Reynolds had noticed something about Reed that never fit the carefree image, something that stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. And when Reynolds eventually spoke, it cast their legendary partnership in a far more complicated light. Their connection didn't begin with spectacle. It began quietly, almost by accident. Reed crossed paths with Reynolds in the mid-1970s, appearing alongside him in early projects that didn't yet feel historic. Those films gave Reynolds a front-row seat to something others missed. Reed wasn't trained like a traditional actor. He didn't polish performances into neat edges. What he had instead was timing, instinct, and a natural ease that cameras rarely forgive in newcomers. Reynolds noticed immediately. By then he was already a force in Hollywood. After Deliverance, he had exploded into stardom, and films like The Longest Yard cemented his appeal. By the mid-1970s, Reynolds wasn't just starring in movies, he was shaping them. That influence mattered when Smokey and the Bandit came together. Reynolds wasn't only the star, he was steering the project's creative direction. When it came time to cast the truck-driving counterpart meant to balance the Bandit's swagger, the studio floated safer names. From their perspective, Reed was a musician first, a novelty casting choice with limited film experience. Reynolds disagreed. He insisted on Reed because he understood what couldn't be taught. Reed was Southern. He knew the rhythms, the pauses, the humor, the culture the film depended on. Reynolds trusted that authenticity completely. Reed didn't need Hollywood's approval. He was already a Grammy-winning musician, revered for his songwriting and guitar work. Songs like Guitar Man and Amos Moses had made him a distinct voice in American music long before audiences saw him on screen. What he lacked was a defining film role. Smokey and the Bandit changed that. Reed didn't just play Snowman, he shaped the film's heartbeat. He wrote and performed Eastbound and Down, a track so perfectly matched to the story that it became the movie's pulse. For many viewers, the opening notes alone still conjure CB radios, truck stops, and open highways. On screen, their chemistry felt effortless. Reynolds brought movie star confidence and outlaw charm. Reed countered with grounded humor, plain talk, and impeccable timing. Audiences saw laughter and loyalty. What they didn't see were the tensions that come with talent, pride, and two strong personalities sharing a spotlight. Years later, when Reynolds finally spoke about Reed, it wasn't to diminish the magic people loved. It was to tell the fuller truth about a partnership that worked brilliantly on screen and demanded far more behind it. They reunited for Hooper, where Reed slipped back into Reynolds' world as if he had never left it, enhancing the rhythm without ever disturbing it. Then came Smokey and the Bandit 2, followed by the ensemble chaos of the Cannonball Run. When Reynolds chose not to return for the third Bandit film, Reed stepped into the lead himself, an unthinkable move just a few years earlier. That decision alone revealed how far Reed had come, and how tightly his screen identity had become woven into a franchise Reynolds had helped define. Off-screen, the friendship matched what audiences sensed. They shared roots, humor, and a Southern identity that felt lived in, not performed. Reynolds spoke often of Reed's rare ability to move between music and film without losing credibility in either world. Yet even at their peak, Reynolds noticed what most people missed. Behind the jokes and easy charm were signs of struggle that never reached press tours or interviews. Years later, he admitted those moments stayed with him, troubling him more than he let on. Because while the audience saw perfection, the men behind it were carrying weight the public never knew. For most of his career, Reynolds projected ease and command, a man seemingly untouched by Hollywood's pressure. Privately, his life told a different story, shaped by physical pain, emotional isolation, and consequences that piled up quietly over time. He built his reputation on toughness, refusing stunt doubles and insisting on doing his own falls, fights, and high-risk action. The realism won respect on set, but the damage never healed. Injuries compounded year after year after year in his back, joints, until chronic pain became part of daily life, even as his screen image still suggested invincibility. One of the most severe setbacks came during City Heat, when an on-set accident caused a serious jaw injury that required extensive treatment and a long, brutal recovery. That moment introduced prescription painkillers into his life, and they stayed far longer than intended. What fans never saw was how that injury altered his relationship with pain and control, blurring the line between treatment and dependence just as his box office dominance began to fade. As roles slowed and momentum shifted, the physical limits he'd ignored became unavoidable, shaping his later years in ways few understood. Alongside the physical decline ran an emotional struggle he rarely addressed, a quiet battle that deepened the distance between the man audiences adored and the reality he lived every day. This was due to the fact that his brand relied more on charm, comedy, and self-assurance than on vulnerability. He struggled with depression in private, which got worse as his ailments got worse and his options got less. Later, when he was still identifiable everywhere he went, he admitted to feeling alone. He spoke of a loneliness that was more related to unresolved remorse and the loss of stability he formerly took for granted than it was to celebrity. This volatility also affected his finances, where Reynolds' public persona once more concealed a far more nuanced reality. Even though he made millions during his most prosperous years, the financial stability that his earnings should have given him was gradually eroded by his personal life, career choices, and spending patterns. Reynolds overestimated how rapidly expenses might overwhelm even a sizable inheritance, who lived an opulent lifestyle that assumed his income would never diminish, and made large investments in businesses that failed to yield returns. As the career's momentum waned, as he approached bankruptcy in the early 1990s due to growing debts and legal expenses, the situation deteriorated. His marriage to Lonnie Anderson, which garnered significant media attention from the beginning and grew more tense behind closed doors, was a significant contributing element to his financial difficulties. His finances were depleted by the costly and acrimonious divorce that followed their 1988 to 1994 marriage. This made an already challenging time more emotionally taxing. As his funds declined, Reynolds was forced to auction off priceless antiques and personal relics that were connected to his identity and career. This was not a symbolic move, but rather a practical need to pay off debts that were becoming too much to handle discreetly. Reynolds' romantic life followed a similar pattern of passion followed by loss, with high-profile relationships that frequently left a permanent emotional scar and rarely ended happily. Even though he was connected to a number of well-known people throughout the years, one relationship continued to play a significant role in his thoughts long after it ended: his relationship with Sally Field, whom he subsequently called his true love. The early 1980s saw the end of their romance, which developed during the height of his success. Reynolds would subsequently acknowledge that the split plagued him more than he let anybody see at the time, turning into a source of remorse that kept coming back as other parts of his life fell apart. The discrepancy between Burt Reynolds' real standing in Hollywood and his reputation widened over time, because the momentum that had propelled his career started to fade in ways that were hard to reverse after he dominated the box office throughout the 1970s and into the early 1980s. His reputation as a leading man was damaged by a run of poor movies. He was followed into decision-making rooms by rumors of conflicts on set and defiance of studio expectations. Executives' perceptions of him were gradually altered by this. Reynolds faced a professional fall he had not anticipated and did not publicly acknowledge at the time, as the industry that had previously created projects around his presence became wary and then aloof. Reynolds kept working, but the parts no longer carried the cultural gravity of his earlier triumphs, and the confidence that once gave him power in Hollywood negotiations no longer translated into influence. The industry had shifted, and Reynolds, who had thrived when instinct and personality still ruled, found himself navigating a system that no longer rewarded the very qualities that made him a star. That is why his casting in Boogie Nights stunned nearly everyone. As a volatile, demanding director, Reynolds delivered a performance stripped of charm and bravado, replacing it with something exposed and unsettling. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination and briefly repositioned him as a serious dramatic actor, reopening doors that had seemed permanently closed. Yet even as critics celebrated the reinvention, Reynolds recoiled from it. He later described the film as too dark, admitting discomfort with the tone and what it asked him to confront. It reflected a deeper conflicted struggle to reconcile a carefully built public legacy with roles that challenged and dismantled it. While critical respect flickered back into view, his physical reality continued to close in. Years of injuries and pain management had taken a toll, and prescription medication remained a constant presence in his life. As he aged, frailty became harder to hide. Heart problems followed, culminating in quintuple bypass surgery in 2010. A stark reminder of how much his body had absorbed long after the cameras stopped applauding his toughness. Still, Reynolds refused to disappear. He continued accepting roles and making appearances, even as his health declined. Privately, however, he began speaking more candidly about loneliness and regret, especially as friendships faded and the pace of life slowed. He reflected on decisions that haunted him, including turning down roles that later became landmarks of American cinema. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. In terms of endearment, choices he acknowledged might have reshaped his later career. In his memoirs, the bravado fell away. What emerged was a man burdened by mistakes he could no longer correct, unfulfilled despite extraordinary fame, and painfully aware of the cost of a life lived at full throttle. While Reynolds' struggles unfolded mostly out of sight, his closest collaborator during his most celebrated years was facing a quieter unraveling of his own. Jerry Reed's story followed a different road, but it led to consequences just as heavy. Long before audiences knew him as the quick-witted snowman or the man behind some of the most recognizable country guitar riffs of the 20th century, Reed's life had been shaped by instability and scarcity. He was born into a poor cotton farming family in rural Georgia, where financial uncertainty was constant and emotional stability rare. Childhood forced him to mature quickly. At times, he entered foster care as his family situation deteriorated. Moving through homes that offered shelter but little sense of permanence, music became his refuge. He picked up a guitar young and absorbed rhythm and melody instinctively, not academically. By his teenage years, he was already playing bars and nightclubs, performing for adults before he had finished growing up. Reed began recording in the 1950s, entering an industry full of promise but short on patience for artists who defied neat categories. Early label deals failed to deliver real success, not because of limited talent, but because his sound resisted easy marketing. He supported himself with odd jobs while continuing to write, play, and record, driven more by compulsion than ambition. The turning point came when Elvis Presley recorded Reed's song, Guitar Man. The endorsement didn't just elevate the track, it validated Reed himself, opening doors that had long stayed closed. From there, his career gained momentum, leading to chart success, Grammy recognition, and broader visibility. Yet even as professional respect grew, personal habits forged in hardship never loosened their grip, particularly his heavy dependence on cigarettes, a quiet constant that mirrored the weight he carried beneath the humor and music. Reed was a heavy smoker for most of his adult life, a habit rarely discussed publicly but one that quietly reshaped his body over time. To audiences, his easy humor and relaxed presence suggested resilience, as if nothing could touch him. Those closest to him knew better. The energy he projected often masked an ongoing struggle with dependency and self-regulation, a private battle that slowly began to surface in ways he could no longer outrun. As the years passed, the physical cost became undeniable. Reed developed emphysema and other serious respiratory conditions that steadily eroded his stamina and lung capacity. Performing, once effortless and instinctive, turned demanding, then exhausting, and eventually unsustainable. Still, Reed resisted disappearing. He continued to record and step on stage for as long as his body allowed, determined not to let illness define the end of his creative life. His decline was not sudden or dramatic. It was relentless, marked by shorter sets, fewer appearances, and long stretches away from the spotlight. Even then, he kept writing and recording when he could, clinging to creativity as a form of identity when physical strength faded. His voice grew strained, his hands tired more quickly, and the ease that once defined his performances slowly slipped away as Reed's visibility expanded from music into film. A new and quieter pressure emerged. Audiences embraced him on screen, but Hollywood rarely imagined him beyond a narrow range. In Smokey and the Bandit and Hooper, he became synonymous with the comic Southern sidekick, a role built on warmth, timing, and instinct rather than transformation. The performances were beloved, but they fixed expectations around who he was allowed to be. Decades later, his appearance in The Waterboy reinforced that same image, entertaining audiences while quietly confirming that Hollywood still saw him through a familiar lens. That typecasting created a subtle but persistent tension. Outside of film, Reed was already recognized as a serious musical innovator, respected for his guitar technique, songwriting, and creative range. On set, those credentials rarely translated into opportunities that challenged him dramatically. Acting brought visibility and steady work, but it never matched the creative freedom or cultural impact of his music. He remained respected and recognizable, yet confined within an identity he had little power to reshape. Financially, Reed's path reflected the reality faced by many musicians who came of age before artists retained ownership and long-term control over their catalogs. Early contracts, uneven royalties, and inconsistent income meant that success did not always equal security. That reality forced him to stay active and adaptable even when his name carried weight. As country music shifted through the 1970s and 80s, aggressively favoring novelty and youth, Reed was compelled to adjust constantly his sound, his collaborations, his public presence just to remain viable in an industry that rarely stood still. In the 1990s, that adaptability took a different form when he joined the supergroup Old Dogs alongside Waylon Jennings, Mel Tillis, and Bobby Bare. The collaboration wasn't a reinvention designed to chase trends. It was a reminder that Reed's relevance had never come from image or momentum, but from substance, craft, and a lifetime of music that refused to fade quietly. Reed refused to fully withdraw from his creative life as his health declined. Writing, recording, and contributing wherever his physical state permitted, he continued to work in the studio as long as he could, steadily, until his body refused to cooperate. According to those closest to him, not out of duty, but because his default condition had always been creation, Performance, travel, and long sessions were all hampered by the progressive loss of stamina. Reed, however, made a silent adjustment, lowering visibility without signaling the end. Reed's life, which was characterized by endurance rather than ease, came to an end on September 1, 2008, when he passed away in Nashville, Tennessee, from complications associated to emphysema. His death was quickly felt in the film industry as well as in the country music industry. The steadiness of his work and the manner his presence had influenced projects without overpowering them were given more attention in tributes than chart positions or box office results, and even before the public re-examined their collaboration. One voice was particularly significant as thoughts about Reed's legacy started to emerge. In private, Burt Reynolds had expressed opinions about Jerry Reed that exposed a more nuanced and complex reality about the man that viewers believed to be familiar. Later on, this admission would completely change the perception of their well-known friendship. Burt Reynolds speaks up about Jerry Reed. Later in life, Burt Reynolds' public remarks about Jerry Reed had a different impact than the humorous tales that audiences were accustomed to hearing. At that point, there was simply reflection formed by loss and distance, no project to promote, and no picture to preserve. Every time Reed's name was mentioned, Reynolds would always go back to the same spot. His talent wasn't unique, nor was it coincidental. He described Reed as someone who transitioned between acting and music with ease, saying that his instincts enhanced every moment they shared and that Reed understood time in a manner that could not be taught. Reynolds was particularly explicit about how Reed shaped Smokey and the Bandit's character, pointing out that the film's vitality came from its music and rhythm, which Reed helped establish, as well as from performances and stunts. He emphasized time and again that Eastbound and Down was more than just a soundtrack version. It was an integral part of the movie. Reed supplied a balance that allowed the humor to land without feeling forced or overblown. According to Reynolds, who commended Reed's genuine Southern demeanor and astute comedic timing with keeping the film grounded, Reynolds made it apparent that their friendship went well beyond skill. He characterized Reed as a true buddy who shared his passion for humor, storytelling, and country culture rather than just a co-star, someone whose presence was instinctive rather than calculated. Reynolds stressed that the connection that viewers seen on screen was genuine and lasted off-screen, influencing the film's production and the way scenes played out. Reynolds claims that Reed's presence brought a warmth and looseness to the Smokey films that would not have been possible with anyone else. Reynolds' tone changed considerably any time he spoke Red after his death in 2008, and interviews from that time period showed a degree of emotion he seldom permitted himself to display in public. He acknowledged that Reed's death had a profound impact on him, stating that their relationship extended well beyond their time together on television and that losing Reed meant losing one of the few people in Hollywood he could truly trust. The fact that Reynolds called Reed a brother, a term he used, seriously emphasized how uncommon that degree of trust had been in a field where partnerships were frequently short-lived. Reynolds often revisited the now famous casting story with a mix of humor and certainty, recalling how Jerry Reed initially declined Smokey and the Bandit because of scheduling conflicts. Reynolds said he didn't debate, negotiate, or wait. He simply told Reed, laughing but serious, that he would drive to his house, throw him in the car, and take him to the set himself. The insistence wasn't bravado. Reynolds explained later that he believed Reed was the only person who could play Cletus Snowman Snow the right way. Anyone else would have felt manufactured. Reed brought something that couldn't be taught: the cadence, the timing, the cultural truth the film depended on. When reflecting on Reed stepping into the lead role in Smokey and the Bandit Part 3, Reynolds showed no defensiveness. He approached it with warmth and humor, acknowledging Reed's willingness to carry the franchise forward when he chose not to return. Though Reynolds distanced himself from the third film, he never distanced himself from Reed. In his later years, he returned to the same conclusion again and again. Jerry Reed was not just part of his success, he was one of the very few people who truly shared it. Red, for his part, spoke about Reynolds with a quiet honesty that carried no trace of performance. When Jerry Reed talked about Burt Reynolds, he made it clear how central Reynolds had been to his journey in film. He framed him not as a benefactor but as a loyal friend who opened doors when Hollywood had no particular interest in doing so. Reed never softened the truth. His casting in Smokey and the Bandit didn't happen because studios believed in him. It happened because Reynolds insisted. Reed understood that without that push, the role of Snowman could have easily gone to someone safer, more predictable, and more forgettable. He credited Reynolds with seeing beyond novelty and comic relief, recognizing something deeper that others overlooked. In interviews, Reed often smiled when recalling that moment, his tone familiar and unguarded. There was gratitude but no exaggeration, respect but no spectacle. He spoke as someone remembering a personal truth, not polishing a legend. One story, in particular, captured the relationship more clearly than any formal tribute ever could. When Reynolds first called him about the film, Reed explained that commitments and conflicts made it difficult to say yes. Reynolds didn't argue logistics. He didn't sell the script. According to Reed, Reynolds simply made it clear that this was happening. In that moment, Reed understood something important. Reynolds wasn't posturing. He wasn't networking. He was standing his ground for someone he believed in. And that belief, Reed knew, was the rarest currency Hollywood ever offered. Reynolds wanted Reed in the film badly enough to remove every obstacle himself, and that determination carried real weight. Reed agreed, and what followed became one of the most recognizable partnerships in popular American film. The decision didn't just shape a movie. It reshaped how audiences and studios viewed Jerry Reed. He was no longer just a musician who happened to be funny on screen. He became part of a cinematic identity that felt authentic, lived in, and impossible to replace. Years later, when Burt Reynolds chose not to return for Smokey and the Bandit Part 3, Reed found himself in an unexpected position, stepping into the role that had defined Reynolds' screen persona. Rather than treating the moment with reverence or hesitation, Reed talked about it with the same irreverent humor that had always been his signature, blending excitement with disbelief. He joked that now he got to be the bandit, that he didn't have to drive the truck or haul anything, that he finally got the hat and the car. Delivered lightly, the words carried deeper awareness. This wasn't just a costume change. It was a symbolic moment in a friendship, and in a franchise that Reynolds had helped build from the ground up. Reed never framed the opportunity as replacing Reynolds. He understood the difference. He spoke about it as stepping into something his friend had made possible in the first place, carrying it forward rather than claiming it as his own. What Reed never did was overstate his importance in Reynolds' life or suggest parity in Hollywood power. He let small stories, offhand remarks, and unpolished humor speak instead. That restraint revealed the truth more clearly than any dramatic confession could. Their bond was never about ego or competition. It was about trust, timing, and one man recognizing another before the world caught up. In the end, the silence Reynolds broke wasn't an accusation or a revelation meant to wound. It was an acknowledgement that Jerry Reed wasn't just part of the story. He was part of the reason it worked at all. If this story changed the way you see their partnership, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay with us for more untold stories behind Hollywood's most iconic friendships.